All right. Good morning, class. Today we're going to be talking about the theme of strong women, and we're going to be focusing on the movie that we watched yesterday in class and the book that we have been reading these past few weeks. So the book, as you guys know, it's The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, and the movie we watched yesterday was The Color Purple. The movie was released in 1986, and it was adapted from the novel by Alice Walker. I do expect that you guys are taking notes as we go through the PowerPoint, and if you have any questions, just raise your hand on the Zoom. For the synopsis of The House on Mango Street, we know that it's a coming-of-age story. We know that this is about a young Mexican-American girl. Her name is Esperanza Cordero, and this focuses on her experience growing up as a Chicana in a barrio in Chicago, Illinois. So we do see a lot of like things that maybe we as Mexican Americans, most of us, can relate to. We see that she's jumping from house to house, that she has her family renting, so they don't really own a house, and so we see that that is one of her biggest aspirations, that she wants to own a house of her own. So let's go to the next slide, and this is going to talk about the synopsis for the movie that we watched yesterday. The Color Purple. So the movie that we watched yesterday is the epic tale of the life of Celie. She's an African-American woman living in the South. We do see, well, we can assume that this movie was set after the slaves in the South were freed. This was a couple of years after. So we would say that this is a Reconstruction period, because we see that they do have, their freedom, but most of them, and we see it in the movie, are sharecroppers, one, or two, like the main characters in the movie, we see that they have their own land, little plots of land that they work for their own food. So we can imagine that this movie is set at the end of the Reconstruction period or the middle of the Reconstruction period, would be my guess. But we see that Celie struggles with her identity, with sexuality, self-worth throughout the movie, and we can see that through the series of abuses that she is the victim of. All right. So at this point, I am gonna ask Jesus if you could read this slide for me.
It says writing styles comparison. In Cisneros' book, The House on Mango Street is structured into a 44 vignettes, like specific moments in time, their lengths varying from 1 or 2 paragraphs to several pages. And then for Walker, The Color Purple is a 1982 novel written by Alice Walker. The novel is told in epistolary style through the usage of 90 different letters written by the characters.
All right, thank you. All right, so for the writing styles, we see two completely different writing styles. For Sandra Cisneros, the vignettes, they are very short accounts of her experience. So neither of these women are writing in a traditional writing style. We don't see poetry. We don't see prose at all. We don't see a narrative either. But these ladies still manage to tell a story. So for Cisneros, we see that these vignettes are they have like some prose-like structures, yes, but for the most part, they're just small series of accounts of Esperanza's experience as a Mexican-American girl in Chicago. And so we see that these 44 vignettes tell a story, yes, but they're more like scenes, right? So we've seen that. They're like snapshots of Esperanza's life that we can see as she writes these vignettes. And for Walker in The Color Purple, the book we didn't see the book, we saw the movie, right? But we're comparing writing styles here. So we would have to look at the novel. And so the novel, I'm telling you guys, as we see in the movie, Celie and Nettie are exchanging letters from time to time because they're no longer together, right? In the beginning of the movie, we see that Nettie has to stay in her father's home, and Celie is forced to marry Mr. And so they start exchanging letters. And this is how the story is unfolding. We don't get to see that a lot in the movie, but then at the end of the movie, we see Celie reading through Nettie's experiences, and we see the connection between these characters. Okay, for the next slide. All right, so I took the liberty of making a Venn diagram comparing both of these characters. I do advise that you guys take notes on these. This is very, very important, and it will be on your test. For Esperanza, again, Mexican American versus Celie, the African American girl. We see that both stories have the main characters who were sexually abused, and these abuses lead to a fear of sexuality. So what does that mean? Well, in Esperanza Cordero's story, we see that she is exposed to sexuality and boyfriends and all this through her friend. And we see that Esperanza in one of the vignettes, I think it's called The Red Clowns, we see that she is not only remorseful of what happened to her, but we also see that she's angry with her friend. She's angry at Sally and just cursing Sally, really, because she's left alone by her friend at the carnival. And we see that this is where her rape happens. Of course, this is not something that Sally maybe could have helped her with, but maybe she wouldn't have, right? So we don't see what could have happened. We only see that Esperanza is so angry that Sally had told her all these like good stories about sexual encounters, and she's like, well, you were wrong, you know? And so this leads to Esperanza being like, well, everything we see in the movies, the princess and the prince, all these like stereotypical love relationships that we see in media are not true, you know? And so she starts to not only fear her sexuality, as we see that she's like trying to negate that attention from boys, but also we see that she's just rejecting the whole idea of love in that vignette. Another instance that we see in the House of Mango Street is where the girls wear the heels. I don't know if you guys remember this, but the heels were a symbol for her personal struggle with femininity. So when the girls wear these heels, they feel so powerful and like they feel like such a woman. But then you also see that contrast of feelings where, yes, on one hand, the girls feel like women and they feel empowered, but they also have that other feeling of anxiety and fear because these men are catcalling them. And so you see how that is a big struggle within Esperanza Cordero's experience. And for Celie, it's her struggle with man control and violence. And for her, the symbolism is the color purple, where we see this towards the end of the movie with the purple flowers, the purple dress, the purple just colors on the side of Nettie as well when she's arriving, and you see these flowy fabrics in the back of Nettie, and they're purple. And so we see that symbolism for freedom and not only embracing femininity, but power and the unshacklement from male power. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time, you know, to just read through these and make sure that if you don't have your notepad or whatever you're taking notes on, you take a picture of this because this will be on your test. All right. You know what? I have one more thing to add before we move on to the next slide. Remember that both of these characters struggle with the middle ground between girlhood and womanhood, right? So we see that in a lot of ways. We see that Celie is playing with Nettie, the patty cake that we see in the movie. That's her trying to hold on to childhood. Mind you, she's already married, right? And then with Esperanza, we see that she's trying to look to go into like the monkey playground or whatever it was called, and she doesn't feel like she fits in anymore. So we see those two girls struggling with that. All right, so the role of women in the texts. This is very, very important because this is where the lesson is centered. So the role of women in society in both of these stories is very similar. We see that women are viewed as inferior to men. And I mean, as Hispanics, we know that our households are very much patriarchal. You know, I don't know about you guys, but in my experience, my grandpa was the head of the table, right? So for a lot of Mexican American girls and African American girls, it's the same. We see that power, um, not power struggle, but that power dynamic where the father versus the mother is the leading figure of the household. And so we see that in both of these texts. Um, Primarily, women in the House of Mango Street are sex symbols. So that goes back to that, where we see that Esperanza is not happy with that complacent lifestyle, that she sees that every single woman around her is just treated like they don't know what they're doing. We see it with her neighbor, where she's trying to like share these like tips and ideas with the girls about sexuality and boyfriends and like when you grow up you're gonna do this. And then we see that her uncle and her aunt are like, all right, don't tell the girls, like we see that like, well, don't tell the girls they can do anything more than they should, right? And we see that she's trying to thrive, but then they send her back to Puerto Rico. Why? Because as Esperanza mentions in a lot of the vignettes, you know, men, like these people, Mexican Americans, don't like women in power. They don't want to see that. And we also see that in The Color Purple, where instead of treating women like human beings, we see Celie, Nettie, so many of these women treated like property. And of course, we see Sophia in The Color Purple, where she's challenging that. So I'm going to ask if one of you can read the quotes under these texts, please.
So for the house on Mango Street, the quote is, she looked out the window like so many sit at an elbow, Esperanza name, but and for the color purple, I love Harpo. God knows I do, but I'll kill him dead if I let him beat me.
All right, so we see these two contrasting views, right? For the first one, we see Esperanza like, hell no. Like, I am not going to be complacent. I am not just gonna sit still and look pretty and cook like home cooked meals and just look out the window my whole life. Like I want to live, I want to educate myself, I want to get out of Mango Street. And then The Color Purple, we see Sophia saying like, I see Miss Celie like getting beat by her husband. I see Miss Celie being very complacent with her life. I'm not going to be like that. I will not let my husband beat me. I will not let a man control me. So we see those two power struggles in both of the texts. So yes, the roles of women are very complacent, very just viewed as sex symbols, less than human beings. But we also see these characters come up and rise above that complacency. And we see that not only does the main character, in this case Esperanza, rise up from that complacency, but we see Sophia, that is a secondary character, just inspiring the main character, Celie, being like, girl, like, you don't have to deal with that. And so that is what we see in these texts. For the next slide, racism, sexism, and relationship in the texts. So I'm just going to read this really, really quickly. You guys should know this is a Mexican American girl and an African American girl. Of course, we go through racism. Of course, we go through sexism. Of course, our relationships sometimes are toxic. You know, these are very recurring themes on every single book that we've been reading so far. So I don't really see like the point of like recurring, but I am going to mention where we see that in the book. So for the first quote for Cisneros, in the meantime, they'll just have to move a little further north from Mango Street, a little farther away every time. People like us keep moving in. So this is where Esperanza has that little run-in with the white girl that she's friends with. And the white girl that she's friends with, she's like, well, like my family has to keep moving out of these neighborhoods because we have people of color moving in. So we see that racism. We see that these white families no longer want to live in this neighborhood because it's a lot of Mexicans. It's a lot of people of color. And what do they associate that with? They associate that with violence. And needless to say, they want to flee that. That's racist. And then, of course, in the color purple, we see Sophia's running with the mayor and his wife, where Miss Millie is like, oh, girl, like, do you want to be my maid? And Sophia's like, hell no. And what happens? Well, it escalates. And this is seen like Sophia is being rude and violent. And of course, because she's an African American woman, they arrest her. And we see Sophia's like change where she's so, so stubborn in her way of like, I'm not gonna let a man control me. I am not gonna let society control me. And we see that sadness of her arrest and how she's beaten at the jailhouse and how she's beaten into submission because she's that one African American girl that's like, not me. And society doesn't like that. So we see racism and sexism in this. Okay, for the abuse, again, we already know this. This is a recurring theme. We see the Esperanza that she's being kissed without her consent during the first job beignet. And then she's later raped in the Red Clouds vignette. Again, we've been over this, her disillusionment with Sally, the stories about how sex would be like, and she's like, that's not how it felt. You know, she felt violated, she felt fearful, and she thought that it was going to be magical, right? And then for Celie, this story is a little bit more graphic, in my opinion. She was raped by the man that she knew as her father. And we see abuse not only sexually and physically, but mentally. We see that she gives birth to 2 children and that she is taken away from her children, and her children are sold to a family who cannot have their own children. That's abusive. You know, we see that not only she's treated like property, but her children are treated like property. So things to think about, right? Abuse is not only physical abuse. We have to look at what else is abuse in these stories. Okay, for connections. For text to text, of course, between the 2 novels, we see the connections. Another text that we can compare these stories to is To Kill a Mockingbird. This is a story that we read last semester. You guys should remember this. We see the power struggle with Jim and Scout, right? How, of course, the girl has to follow her brother. And we see that power struggle where she's like, nope, not me. Like, I am just as good as you. I am just as strong as you. And of course, how do we connect this to ourselves? Most of us come from a Mexican American family. What do we see in those stories in the house on Mango Street that we see in ourselves? Right? In my experience, and I can share this with you guys, my family's never owned their own home. So to me, that aspiration that Esperanza has of getting her own house and like getting out of that barrio is something that I can relate to. I don't know if you guys relate to that, but you can also make connections of I want to get out of where I'm at right now. I want to be better, right? Text to world. Where do we see that in current events, time periods? What are some ideas that could lead to these events to occur? Well, like we mentioned, the Reconstruction era, we see, of course, Hispanic culture, and that leads us to the historical background. So for the Great Depression, Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, and of course, the post-Civil War, post-slavery era. What do you guys know about these things? Like, what can you guys relate to? Like, let me rephrase that. What are some images or words or ideas that you guys connect to any one of these? Let's focus on Jim Crow laws. What are some ideas that you guys have associated with Jim Crow laws?
Like voting restrictions.
Okay, what else? Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Maybe like certain movie theaters where it's only white people allowed, or
Yes.
sections where colored people can sit.
Good job. So, yes, and we see a lot of these restrictions because if you look at the movie The Color Purple, of course, we see that the shopkeeper treats the white lady with such respect, with the uttermost respect. She's making a fool of herself in the car trying to drive, and people are like, oh, look how foolish. Like Miss Millie's doing so, oh, look at her. But then if we see people of color doing the same things, they're gonna, that's dangerous. How dare she? Right? We see those comparisons. We see that contrast in behavior. And even though we don't see those Jim Crow laws, like as per se, like the definition of Jim Crow laws, we don't see literacy tests, we don't see any of that, but we do see the effects, the aftermath of that, how people are still behaving a certain way towards African American people and a certain way with white people. And for the Great Depression, we see, we see these Hispanic households having to take up any jobs. In the house on Mango Street, we see how they lie about their age just to get a job. So these are things to think about. For today, that's all I have. But thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing your grades on the tests. Remember, these are all things that are going to be on the test. So make sure that you had taking notes, that you were taking notes throughout the presentation. And thank you for your attention, guys.